architects used to learn through apprenticeship. If you wanted to be an architect, I'm talking now going back to the 17th, 16th
Right,
century,
exactly.
you would just get a job as an apprentice in an architect's office. And in England, that continued right up until the 20th century. The idea of teaching architecture in a school really comes from France. They set up essentially schools in art schools, and they expanded them to include architects. So rather than apprenticeship, you went to a school and you learned over, say, 4 or 5 years how to be an architect. By the 20th century, architecture schools get integrated into universities. A lot of people criticize it because architecture is very practical and learning on the job has huge advantages because there is no theories behind architecture. Whatever works,
Right,
doors
yeah.
are 3 feet wide. It's not a theory. That's just a useful size for a door. And interior doors are 30 inches. A front door is 36 inches, and we know that, and
Yeah.
that's just practice that has shown that this works. That's why architects study history. If you want to learn how to design a car, you don't go and take apart a Ford Model T
Yeah.
to learn how to do it because Ford was a great engineer, and it would be a waste of time. There's nothing to learn from a Ford Model T that's useful if you're designing a car today. But in architecture is very different. You can learn things from old buildings. That's why architects study old buildings. They travel and they look at buildings, even going back to the ancient Romans. There's something to learn there.
And when I was talking to Mr. Dwani in episode 4, I think he said, if you're gonna do development, but you have an interest in architecture, or you want to infuse your work with some architectural sensibilities, you may not be able to go get go to a degree in architecture, but you should probably develop a kind of self-study program to at least educate yourself. In your book, How Architecture Works, you seem to take kind of a Google Maps approach. You start with, you're out in space and you talk about what are the ideas that animate this, and you zoom in and there's the setting and the site. For those who haven't read the book, could you maybe give us the brief version of how you designed the course that you would take to unfold it all?
We experience buildings in a very fragmentary sort of way. When you think of the Empire State Building is a building that everybody knows would recognize the shape, but they may not have ever necessarily gone into it or gone up to the top of it. And so the book tries to introduce people to buildings in part just to look at things like the surroundings of a building and how buildings relate to their surroundings, or details of buildings.
Right.
I used staircases and railings as an example of how different architects solve different things. And that was an important part of the course, I think, was to try to give non-architects, the business students, a sense of why architecture is so different and why different architects solve things in different ways, so that they could maximize, in a sense, their relationship with an architect.
I love primary sources, and maybe that's just my background, so I am trying to slog through, Vitruvius and Palladio and these people. What are the books that you think belong on the shelf with, to take a more modern example, a Pattern Language, which I've devoured a number of times, that just give me such an incredible return, to use business language, return on my investment, that I could commend to other business students?
Pattern Language is an exceptional book, and there's nothing like it, because Alexander, the author, really was trying to get at basic things in art. What makes a room nicer? This room, for instance, has windows on 3 sides.
Yeah,
it's much nicer than the traditional modern apartment, which just has a window at one end, because you get glare. There's real physical, it's not aesthetics only, there's real physical, and this is what Alexander explains. So an ordinary person reading that book gets an explanation of why windows on more than one wall feel better. So he kind of demystifies it. A A very good book is a book by Stuart Brand, who was the editor of the Whole Earth Catalog, and he wrote a book called How Buildings Learn. One of the issues that we know a lot about in buildings is that buildings last a very long time.
Yeah.
I mean, a building can last 100 years, and it can go through many different uses. So it might start out as a residential building, then it becomes a professional office building, then it goes back to residential. So what we know architecturally is that buildings that have inherent flexibility are better over the long term because they can be converted from one use to the other.
Right.
Whereas a building, say a very heavy concrete building that's perfectly designed for one use, you can never change it. It's way too expensive to change it. That's why a lot of these brutalist concrete buildings from the 60s tend to get demolished because they're too difficult to change. Everything is concrete, everything is fixed. You know, the industrial buildings of the 19th century with those, you know, big spans where they would have machinery in them are very flexible inherently. So they can be used they can be a factory, they can be an office building, they can be a condominium. We don't build that anymore, and that's a problem for people down the road. But that does cost more on day one. So the question is, does the developer have an interest in doing that? Can he get the advantage from doing that? Because otherwise, he's not going to invest for the future.
Do you have any advice either for architecture students or for people in development regarding learning more about construction? It seems like something that's kind of, I don't say it's looked down upon, but it's like, well, you know, once we have everything finished, then we'll hand it over to the contractor and they handle the dirty details of building. And I've spent a lot of time asking, you know, what is that material that you're using there? Or what does a limestone facade actually cost? And it's very difficult to find that kind of information. Did you have conversation partners who were structural engineers and builders? Or how does one go get that kind of knowledge?
It's tough because I think that the limitation of some developers is that they see architecture and engineering as a constant. It's something you plug into it, rather than something that you can manipulate to improve a project and make a project better. And one of the examples I use, you mentioned Andres Duany, is new urbanism, because what new urbanism does is it takes design and it turns it into a development advantage. And the main attribute of new urbanism projects is they actually gain value from their design. And design is not something that you add on at the end of the project. It's really something that makes the success of the project possible. And I think that's true. That's also true in other areas. John Portman was a developer with an architecture background, and he basically invented the atrium project, which is taking a architectural element of a building like an atrium and making it so successful that it becomes the main development attribute of the project. And the Portman hotels with those great atriums was really an invention where the architectural design became part of the development process. And I think that's the most useful way to use architecture, rather than to see it as something that you add on at the end as a kind of, it's an expense, but it only adds cost to the project. I think seeing it as the potential for adding value as well as cost. Architecture always costs more money than doing it cheaply. But I think if it can add value, then there's a reason to spend money on it. And Peter Lindemann we would have discussions about architecture, and I mean, he's an economist, but he would always ask, this costs me, but what does it add to the project in terms of real value? And I think architects need to learn that if they want to work with developers, because architects often would like to do things, but if they don't add value to a project, it's hard to convince a developer to spend money on them. most developers are not going to just spend money because the architect would like to do it. They would like to see some return on that extra money. And that's probably the most difficult part of the architect-developer relationship is getting those priorities kind of lining up on the same side.
That's a very interesting issue, because one of the first things that I thought about in doing this series were the different incentive structures that were in place for all the different, I look at planners, architects, and developers. But correct me if I'm wrong, financially, a developer and an architect have almost the opposite priority when it comes to the price of a structure, because the architect is often paid, and correct me if I'm wrong, is often paid a percentage, so there's an incentive for the building to be more elaborate, whereas the developer is trying to keep the margin, so the lower the cost. Has there ever been an attempt to work out some kind of a thing to align fiscally the priorities of architect and developer?
Yeah, most architects today work on a time basis.
Okay.
So what you're saying is true if you're designing a house, but it's less true for large commercial buildings.
Okay.
But you're right that there is that lining up the priorities of the two parties is important. One example I came across was a company in Seattle, and what the developer did is he made the architect a partner in the project.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you're going to get a percentage of the profits, and that lined up things in a different way, because for very often you have to remember the architect gets nothing if the project is successful.
Right.
The developer might get something
Some
because
windfall,
he's able
yeah.
to rent it at higher rents, but the architect isn't not being a partner, not sharing in any of the profits, doesn't really have much incentive, for instance, to save money or to do something that will benefit the project down the road.
Right.
Very often the best projects are the ones where the developer has a very long-term stake in the building.
Of course.
Where he owns the building for a long time.
So they'll make the kind of investment decision, which is
right,
yeah.
and then the making a building that will last longer or have lower maintenance makes sense for the developer
Exactly.
because he's a long-term owner. But the worst projects, I would say, architecturally, are the ones where there's a very short-term
Of course.
ownership. For instance, most single-family housing, production housing, which is sold to somebody,
Right.
the developer really owns it, for 6 months, and then it's sold to the home buyer, and then it's the home buyer's problem. And often the quality of that housing is not very high because it's really not an issue compared to, say, a multifamily rental housing where, heating and maintenance are part of the life of the
Operating
building,
expenses.
which is part of the development project.
What does an architect want and not want to see when approached by a developer? Is it helpful or off-putting to come with a kind of mood board of sorts with, I'm thinking about this and that? Is that welcome?
It's useful to provide architects with visual information. The more visual, the better. So if there are buildings that you like, or there are spaces that you like, or interiors that you like, that's useful because then the architect gets a sense of your taste, of kind of what you're hoping for. He might say, this is impossible, our budget doesn't allow this, but I think it's actual pictures from magazines, from
So that's
whatever.
not seen as an encroachment on the architect's.
No. I mean, if an architect reacts really negatively, maybe you should change architects, because the architects I know tend to welcome that because it's like a part of a dialogue.
I know you're not hot on, from reading your blog, you're not hot on 3D printing and modeling and so on. I mean, I've been, toying with SketchUp and these other things which, for professionals I'm sure are silly. But, I can insert a person in there and I can get scale and I can,
Right.
with a click of a mouse, move a wall 10 feet and print it. But you don't think those are advances?
I'm worried about them. I don't know what they are. I mean, I'm not they're not going away. So
Right. Yeah.
there's no question that
Like
is
the buildings
future.
that eventually are built using them, they're.
But whether that it will make for better buildings, I don't know. I think there was a reason for instance, if you look at the drawings of somebody like Louis Kahn, he loved to work in charcoal, and when he would start sketching a building, he would work in charcoal, and it's all kind of smudgy and sometimes hard to see what's going on, and that was purposeful because things were not set yet. He wasn't sure what it was going to be, and the charcoal kind of makes it vague. And you don't start designing a building by doing a toilet or a sink. In fact, you don't do the bathroom at all. You just make a square, and that's the bathroom. For now, that's enough. Whereas on a computer, you drop in the toilet immediately because the computer has these perfect little templates for toilets. And it's very hard to be vague on a computer. Architecture is becoming more like appliances and industrial design. Buildings are not like, for me, they're not like architecture. They become more like industrial design or appliance design.
Yeah.
And you get high-rise buildings. I mean, people make up names for them, the cheese grater. But the reason is they don't look like buildings. They look like kitchen appliances. And so people give them those names. I think that's directly connected to the computer and the ability to make these shapes that don't relate necessarily to steel or concrete or building. They're just the shape that comes out of the computer. And architects, I know young architects are very caught up in that. They're fascinated by these combined shapes, but whether that makes for better architecture, I'm skeptical.